all of the messengers we believe in, they all called to the worship of Allah alone. فأولهم نوح عليه السلام. فأولهم نوح عليه السلام. The first of the messengers was Noah. Nuh عليه السلام. أرسله الله إلى قومه لما غلوا في الصالحين. Allah sent him to his people when they began exaggerating in the righteous people. So we mentioned when Adam alayhi salam was created, he was created upon Tawheed. And then 10 generations went by and the shirk then began. That's where we left it off. So now we'll have a look at that story regarding how shirk first began. So at the time of the people of Noah alayhi salam, 10 generations down now, there were at that time righteous people, just like there had been in the 10 generations coming down. There were some righteous people in that era. Mentioned in the Quran, Wad, Suwa', Yaghuth, Ya'uq, Nasr, names of righteous people who lived in and around that 10th generation. When these righteous and pious people died, and they all died close by to each other in time, in that 10th generation or thereabouts, when these righteous people all died, pious people that the community used to love, the community, the society used to respect and love those righteous and pious people, so they all died in a short period of time. And so the community, the society, the people were all left grieving the death of these handful of righteous and pious people. They were left in a state of sorrow, in a state of loss, in a state of grieving over the deaths of these pious people gone now. So then the scholars, they mention Shaitan, for the first time in 10 generations, saw an opening for himself. The Shaitan saw an opportunity to exploit the emotions of the people, to exploit the state that they were in now, in this grief at the loss of the righteous people. They were grieving, they were sad, they were emotional. The Shaitan saw an opening for himself, saw an opportunity. So he came to the people, and now those righteous ones have been buried. They've been buried at the graveyards at a distance away from the villages. The Shaitan came to the people and reminded them of those righteous people. And the people had great love for them and they were still grieving for them. Shaitan suggested to them, you should go to the graves of those pious people where you buried them. Go to their graves. Look at the graves where you buried them so that it reminds you of them. And when it reminds you of them, you will be reminded of how pious they used to be and how righteous they used to be. And that will then help you and encourage you. So it will be good for you to go and visit their graves where you buried them, to remember and reflect upon their piety, to therefore encourage yourself. So the people obviously thought that's a good idea. So they went. They went to the graves of where they'd buried those righteous people, and they reflected upon those righteous people and went back. No shirk, no shirk. Just went there, reflected and went back. The Shaitan then said to them, but wait, when you go there, and these graveyards were outside of the villages at the edges or somewhat of a distance away. The shaitan said, when you go there to the graves, don't just go and come back. When you go there, you want to really reflect upon the lives of these pious and righteous people. Stay there for a while. Spend some proper time there. Reflect and ponder. Stay there hours at a time. Do, as we say now, i'tikaf at the graves. I'tikaf just means spending time in one fixed place. So the shaitan encouraged them to go to the graves and spend lengthy periods of time looking and reflecting and pondering. So the people began doing that. No shirk though. That isn't shirk. They went there, they sat there, they pondered, they reflected for lengthy periods of time and came back. No shirk. Then the shaitan with his next step, and the scholars they say, look at how shaitan did this all in steps. The next step, he said to them, okay, look, you go out to the graveyards, it's a distance, then you spend your time there, then you come back. Why not just make some figurines, some pictures, something that represents those righteous people, and put those figurines and pictures and things, representations of them, in your villages, in your community halls, as we say now, the meeting places, the gathering places, in your homes. Put those representations of them that you make in your villages and gathering places, so that every time, every day, in and around, here and there, out and about, you see these representations of those righteous people, and you remember and reflect. And you don't have to go out to the graves every how many days you go out there. They'll be with you always. You'll see them everywhere, their pictures, their images, their figurines, their representations, and you'll constantly be reminded of their piety, and that'll be good for you. So they did it. They made representations and figurines of those pious people, and they put them around their villages. That in of itself not necessarily shirk yet. They've made representations and they put them around, but they haven't committed shirk in terms of now prostrating or making dua or anything to them. They've just put them there to just reflect. When they see them, they reflect upon their piety. So still no shirk in terms of shirk as we define it properly. Then, after time went by, and now these people have got these representations and figurines of those deceased individuals. They look at them, they reflect, they ponder. Time went by. Those people now, that generation died. Their children came, the next generations came. When those next generations came, and they didn't know what these representations are, why had our forefathers put these things everywhere around the villages, what was the story behind them? These new youngsters, as we say now, the new generation, the new people didn't know. So then the shaitan came with his next step. He came to them and whispered to them and told them, these representations, these figurines, these pictures, modeling, whatever it was of the type, they were made by your forefathers because when there was a drought, they used to call upon them. When there was a drought, your forefathers used to call upon them. That's why they're everywhere in your villages and all over the place. They used to call upon them. They used to make dua to them. So now this new generation didn't know any better. They didn't know why their forefathers had these things and what they were and the righteous people. They didn't know any of that. They didn't know any better, so they fell into the whisperings of the shaitan and began calling upon those statues or those representations and figurines. They began calling upon them. believing the whisperings of the shaitan that their forefathers had built them to call upon them. And that's where the shirk first began. When they began calling upon those idols, then that was now an act of worship being done to others besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who can tell us then what was the cause of that chain of events leading to shirk? That was a chain of events that led to the shirk finally occurring. In fact, let's mention the narration first, then you can tell us. The narration is of Ibn Abbas in Sahih al-Bukhari, where he said, هذه أسماء رجال صالحين من قوم نوح فلما هلكوا أوحى الشيطان إلى قومهم أن أنصبوا إلى مجالسهم التي كانوا يجلسون فيها أنصابا وسموها بأسمائهم ففعلوا ولم تعبد. He said that these are the names of righteous men. Wad, Su'a, Yaghuth, Ya'uq, Nasr. They are the names of righteous men from the people of Nuh, the generation of people at that time. But when they died, those righteous people, this is the hadith in Bukhari now. When those righteous people died, Shaitan whispered to their people, the society at the time, make representations of them, make figures of them and put them in your places where you sit. And then name those idols by the names of the righteous people. Give them the same names as what the righteous people were actually called, so that they are full on representations of them. So they did that. فَفَعَلُوا وَلَمْ تُعْبَدْ. But they didn't worship them. حَتَّى إِذَا هَلَكَ أُولَئِكَ. Until when those people, then that generation died, وَنُسِيَ الْعِلْمِ, and knowledge was forgotten, the following generations no longer knew why their forefathers had these statues and things. Knowledge was lost. Then when knowledge was lost, حتى إذا هلك أولئك ونسي العلم عبدت. Then when the knowledge was lost, they began to be worshipped. That's the narration highlighting the story we've just mentioned. So now, there was a chain of events. What was the root and the cause from the beginning of the chain that led to that shirk in the end? Because Shaitan could not convince the people to immediately commit shirk. Why not? It was too obvious because for 10 generations they had all been upon Tawheed. 10 generations, 1,000 years, Tawheed, Tawheed. Shaitan wasn't going to just come now and suddenly overnight make them commit shirk. Wasn't going to be possible. So there was a chain of events. And the scholars, they say, look at how Shaitan was patient. Slowly, one step at a time, building his plot. Chain of events leading to the shirk, and the core of it was love. What do you mean?
Love of the ancestors.
But that's allowed. You're not allowed to love your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather.
The thing of following them.
Following them. If your grandfathers were ulama, alhamdulillah, we'll all follow them. So we need something more detailed than even that. It was, you're right what you're saying, just a bit more detail on how to say it, that they exaggerated in their love for them. They were excessive in their love for them. Exaggeration and excessiveness led to that. That's why Islam prohibits exaggeration and excessiveness in affairs. Moderation, not exaggeration and excessiveness. Those people loved those righteous people so much that the shaitan slowly managed to convince them to make statues of them and name them by the name of those pious people. because of their excessiveness in how much love they had for those pious people. That ghulu, that excessiveness, is what led that chain of events to finally come to shirk occurring. So that is the story of how shirk first began, and Insha'Allaah ta'ala, I don't think anybody's ever gonna forget that now. So then, وَآخِرُ الرُّسُلِ, the last of the messengers was Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَهُوَ الَّذِي كَسَّرَ صُوَرَ هَؤُلَاءِ الصَّالِحِينَ. The final messenger then, throughout history from Noah, messengers came, prophets came. The last of them in the end was Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was the final messenger to be sent. And the author mentions here, وآخر الرسل محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو الذي كسر صور هؤلاء الصالحين. And he is the one who destroyed the idols of those righteous people. Meaning, there is a story behind this as well. Those idols that were then made at that time when Shaitan convinced them, just make idols, make figurines and statues and put them in your places, so when you see them you'll remember them. They were made. They made those statues then. Those statues that they made, when the floods came at the time of Nuh alayhi salam, when the people of Noah, they disbelieved, the majority of them, so the punishment of Allah came, and the floods they came. How the water, it opened up from the clouds, and it opened up from the ground, and all of the waters they met, and they made floods higher than the mountains. The kuffar were destroyed. Those idols, what happened to them? They were washed away in the floods. The idols, they were washed away in the floods. When the flood waters finally receded, when the flood waters finished, then the ground became apparent again. Those idols then settled into the ground, and over time then they were buried by sand and stone and everything coming on top of them. They were buried in under the ground. Geographically where? In what is modern day Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. In the beaches of Jeddah, on those beaches is where those idols landed and just went into the soil and were buried there after the floods finished. And they remained there, buried underground. After the floods finished and the soil settled, they were left buried underground there. And they remained, and they remained, and they remained, up until the time of the final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. There was a man by the name of Amr ibn Luhay al-Khuza'i. This man, the shaitan whispered to him. He was a man, they say, was affected and influenced by the idol worship. He'd been to Sham and other places, and he'd seen the mushrikun and what they do. He was influenced by those affairs. And the shaitan whispered to him, go to the location, the beaches of Jeddah, as we now know them to be. Go there and dig up. He went and dug up and found those original idols from the time of Noah. And shaitan whispered to him, go and spread these amongst the Arabs. One here, one idol there, one idol in that land. Spread them to the Arabs that they be worshipped. And so he did. Then the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was sent as a prophet, as a messenger. Then we know the hijrah happened. All of the Muslims, the Prophet, everybody had to leave Mecca and go to Medina because of the oppression of the kuffar. Then 8 years later, after they migrated to Medina, there were enough Muslims now. They came back to reclaim Mecca. They came back. And that's the year, the conquering of Mecca. So when they came back and they conquered Mecca in the 8th year of Hijri, that's the year then when they entered, and when they got to the Kaaba, there were hundreds of idols. the mushrikun had, whilst they were in control of Mecca, they had hundreds of idols around the Kaaba. In some narrations, 360 idols in and around the Kaaba, in the Kaaba, around the Kaaba. So when the conquering of Mecca occurred, the Prophet ﷺ, it's mentioned in the seerah, with his spear was breaking those idols and reciting جاء الحق وزهق الباطل. Truth has come and falsehood is destroyed and gone. So that's when all the idols were destroyed, and that's when these 5 idols were also destroyed. As Shaykh Al-Fawzan said, look at the impact of shirk. These idols came from the time of the first messenger, and they remained in existence and were only destroyed at the time of the last messenger. The long effects of shirk.